all the black bar to the top right, all the way up as far as possible. Thank you. Great. Turn off the audio because it seems like I'm getting feedback here. All right, my audio is off. Any idea why I'm getting
Your
here?
speaker is probably one.
This is audio and video. All right.
You can turn your microphone off and the speaker.
There we go. We can actually accomplish that.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, everybody hear me remotely? I think the answer is yes. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. So I'm gonna bore you to death with this, but this is the way it goes. So we're gonna go to the purchase contract and all of the other ancillary disclosures that are associated when writing a purchase contract. So when you're writing a purchase contract, the very first form, when you pull up zip forms, is going to be disclosure regarding a real estate agency relationship. And it's required by law, and it's just describing the duties between us and the clients. It's also required in the event you have a lease agreement that's for a period of in excess of 1 year. So regardless of that, we always require this, whether it is a purchase contract and or a lease agreement. So nothing special about it. But what is special about this form? If we look at the second page, and remember, for the most part, everybody's signing things electronically. It doesn't always take place that way. But on the second page of the disclosure regarding agency relationship, you can see this block. It says seller's brokerage firm. It's just an example. It is nothing that must be completed, nor when you're completing the form via zip forms, can you even fill in that information. But this information is going to be found on page 1 of the residential purchase agreement. So I just want to make sure about that. And then the next form. And this is interesting, the way to order. Right, there are other disclosures in here, but right now it's going directly to the California Residential Purchase Agreement. There's other documents in here that are going to be required. We'll go over those later. But anyways, if we're going to be writing a purchase contract, the date prepared, in this case, for our example, we have a date prepared of August 21st of 2020. This date is critical when you're writing an addendum to the purchase contract or anytime you're referencing anything associated with the purchase contract. So let's assume we wrote the offer today, August 21st, but acceptance was tomorrow. If I'm going to write an addendum to the purchase contract, an amendment to the purchase contract, these additional forms are going to ask to identify the California Residential Purchase Agreement, also known as the RPA. And this is the date that we are always going to be referencing. We will never reference the date of acceptance. So keep that in mind. And you'll see that happening quite often, as a matter of fact. So section 1A, this is an offer from, if we had a buyer, we would insert the buyer's name. And when determining who the buyer is, remember now I see, for the most part, it's not just individuals. It could be a trust, a revocable trust. It could be an LLC. It could be any type of a corporation. But LLCs and trusts and individuals are common in regards to who the buyer is. And that becomes important in regards to documentation that's going to be required. So the property to be acquired is, and this is very simple, the property address. Now, when you're writing a purchase contract, I'm not logged into zip forms, but when you're going to be writing a purchase contract, there's something called MLS Connect. And before you write a purchase contract, and you would actually determine what the listing ID is. And when having a listing ID within MLS Connect, you would click on that button, insert the listing ID, and it's going to populate a lot of information that you need. It's going to populate, for example, the name of the listing office. It's going to populate the Department of Real Estate, their license number, so on and so forth. All critical in regards to writing a purchase contract. Because when we get to the signature pages, you as an agent, you're going to be required to sign the purchase contract, not in the capacity as a principal, but in terms of the agency relationship. A confirmation of agency is very critical in regards to any purchase contract that is drafted. As a matter of fact, if we make a mistake in the section 2B, we need to correct that information because it is required by California law. So if you look at section 2B, it says confirmation, and this block is exactly what was mirroring in the disclosure regarding agency relationship. And under confirmation, seller's brokerage firm, if let's assume it's our office, Coldwell Banker Platinum Properties, that's representing it, we would insert that information and we would insert the license number. And likewise, for the buyer's brokerage firm, in this case, we're saying it's going to be Coldwell Banker Platinum Properties. Now, in the event the buyer's agent and the listing agent fall within the same brokerage, it is considered to be dual agency, even though it's not the same individual who's representing the buyer and or seller. So if it were to be somebody that you work with out of this office, we would check the box under section 2B, under the seller's brokerage firm, both the buyer and seller's dual agents. And then where it states buyer's brokerage firm, if it were the same office, we would check the box, both the buyer and seller. As a matter of fact, the zip forms, when you check the box under section 2B, specifically under the seller's brokerage firm, it is going to automatically default for the buyer's brokerage firm to be checked also in the same capacity. So you need to be sure that you insert the proper license information for the brokerage who's representing the buyer and or seller, in addition to the license information for the individual agent. Otherwise, confirmation of agency is not complete. And even though you may have an accepted purchase contract thereafter, you would have to issue Form AC, confirmation of agency, to confirm the agency relationship. And then section D, potentially competing buyers and sellers. What is going to be attached to the RPA packet is a PRBS, possible representation of more than one buyer seller. And that form is going to notify buyers and or sellers that, for example, if you have the listing, I may have another property listed that exactly matches yours. And I'm notifying you of that information. Likewise, I may have multiple buyers who are interested in your property. So that's what the PRBS is doing. It's nothing more than a disclosure, and it doesn't encumber anything or cause any concern from my perspective. But it's something you'll be having the buyer and or seller sign. And then section 3, this is where we actually begin to fill out the purchase contract, the purchase price. So in this case, there's nothing shown in there under section 3A. And if you look at the next block or column, it says PARA with a pound sign or hashtag sign, and it's referring to different aspects of the purchase contract. In this case, under section 3A, it's referring to sections 5 and 5B of the purchase contract. So in this case, we would simply insert the purchase price. Let's assume it's $1 million. And then to the very right, under additional terms, it is available, check the box for all cash. If we check the box for all cash, the loan contingency is waived. And you don't have to specify that the loan contingency is waived. Under section 5 of the purchase contract, language exists indicating that if it's an all cash offer, the loan contingency is waived. That will go down farther. If you were to check the box also that loan contingency is waived, that's acceptable also. And then section 3B, close of escrow. There's nothing filled in, but what I would suggest, there's a box, you check the box so many days after acceptance. And commonly we would say 30 or 45 days after acceptance. I don't suggest putting in a specified date. Let's assume we say, what is the date today? It is the 21st of August. And we were to say September 15th, well, it may take 5 days to even get an accepted purchase contract. And we're still obligated to close as of that period of time. So a time frame such as 30 days after acceptance is probably the most acceptable way to manage any type of offer that you're making. Any questions about that? Yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory, huh? Section 3C, expiration of offer. 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures. So when we look at the signature pages, let's assume we write the offer, but the buyers don't sign until tomorrow. So the expiration of the offer is 3 days after the date of the last signature. Keep that in mind also. And here's what we typically will encounter. There may be offers submitted and they may expire. However, when we look at the counteroffer form, there's language in the counteroffer form that says that it's expired, but yet now we're all agreeing to extend the expiration date. However, if it expires, the buyer is no longer obligated, even though the seller responds at a date beyond that. But there's just a way to facilitate issues in which the offer has actually expired. Section 3D1, initial deposits. Now, this is typically just it is a fixed amount. So if the purchase price is $1 million, and we said we're going to be putting 3% of the purchase price down, if the purchase price increases to $2 million, and originally we stated in this cell that we're going to deposit $30,000, the $30,000 does not become $60,000. It is a fixed amount. The percentage is just simply a calculation of the initial deposit. So if I make an offer for $1 million and I say I'm going to put $30,000 down as my initial deposit, we agree upon a purchase price of $2 million. Section 3D1 does not change unless the counteroffer indicates that the buyers to increase their deposit maybe up to $60,000. And then to the right, if you'll notice, it says within 3 business days. So we're talking about the time frame in which the initial deposit is to be made. And this is the only aspect of the purchase contract that we're referring to business days. So everything else is our calendar days. And this is where it becomes a problem, especially if you're a listing agent. And actually, if you're representing a buyer. We're here to represent our buyer in the best possible capacity, but we also want to push them forward to close these transactions. Buyers get cold feet. So let's assume we have acceptance of a contract on a Friday. The buyer has until Wednesday of the following week to deposit their initial deposit. That's a long time. That's 5 days. People change their minds. So do we want to, and now if we want to express an offer that's more aggressive when submitting an offer to a listing agent, and remember it's more of a buyer's market today, maybe we change that to 1 business day. So it's something to give consideration to. If the buyer doesn't deposit the money, it makes sellers concerned. Now, what happens if a buyer does not actually deposit the money as agreed? What can the seller do? Well, the seller can only then provide the buyer with a notice to perform, and thereafter, following the expiration of 2 days, and the following day, can the seller cancel the contract. So if I'm a listing agent and I receive a purchase contract and it says 3 business days and acceptance is on Friday, what I can do to help give myself the ability to cancel the contract, 2 days before the time frame in which the buyer must perform, I can send a notice to perform. So in my example, we have acceptance today. We said the initial deposit is scheduled to be made no later than Wednesday of the next week, because we're talking about 3 business days, right? On Monday, no sooner than Monday, I can send out a notice to perform to the buyer to say, you must deposit your money by the close of Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. And if you don't, on Thursday of that week, I can then cancel the agreement as a seller. Let's see some, those are works on their basis, right?
It doesn't mean you're gonna cancel.
Doesn't
Just
mean
let
you're
them know
going
that
to
you can
cancel.
if you want to.
But if the buyer refuses to deposit their money after all that time, do you want to continue engaging with the buyer in the transaction when they're not willing to deposit the money?
Yeah, they've already had 5 days to do it.
You've already had 5 days to do it, so maybe it's in your best interest to put them on notice. Most agents on the other side who receive a notice to perform find it very offensive. And A way to approach it might be saying, well, our office requires that we always provide a notice to perform, just because that's our office policy. Not because the seller or the buyer is being aggressive in regards to removing these contingencies or performing, but it's something to give consideration to. But if you want to make your offer appear much more aggressive, change that 3 business days to 1 business day. Carlos, can you turn that AC down?
Don't know how to do that, but.
I think it's all the hot air I've got coming in my mouth, right?
You don't hold.
You want that?
I have a
You
question.
want me to do it? What's that?
The 3D1, do we have to fill both the exactly amount and the percentage?
No, the system will actually populate the percentage for you.
Oh, okay,
It will do that.
okay.
And then you'll see directly below in parentheses, it says percentage number above is for calculation purposes and is not a contractual term.
Okay.
And there's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The next question, for the blank, do we need to cross out the NA or just leave it blank?
The NA?
NA, so everything.
No, there's, if there are blanks in the contract, there's no reason that you need to specify NA.
Oh, okay,
If you think about it, you're going to write the offer. You're then going to be submitting a PDF to the listing agent. So you have a document that everybody can refer to in the past if somebody's trying to modify anything like that. So that's not necessary. So that's the initial deposit. Section 3D2, increased deposit. I would say I have never come across anybody in a traditional residential transaction using the increased deposit. It's usually more so for commercial transactions. Let's assume we reach a certain milestone, maybe the seller has demanded or the buyer is willing to increase their deposit based upon getting permits or something like that. So we'll just kind of skip over we would skip over the increased deposit. Section 3E1, loan amount. Now, in this particular case, let's assume we're purchasing a property for $1 million and we intend to put 20% down. Well, the loan amount in that case would be $800,000. So it's section 3D1. Now, this is the exact polar opposite of the initial deposit. So the purchase is going to be a 20% loan, 80% loan to value. Now, in the event where our purchase price increases to $1 million or to $2 million, the contract stipulates that the loan amount and the down payment will adjust based upon the percentage. So in this case, the loan amount, if I put $800,000 in there, it's going to show what the percentage of the purchase price is. But if we finally agree upon a purchase price of $2 million, then the contract indicates that it is going to be adjusted on a pro rata basis. So what is a 20% loan to value or an 80% loan to value on a $2 million transaction? It's $1.6 million, right? That's the amount of the loan that I'm going to be obtaining. So unlike the initial deposit, that will automatically adjust. Now to the right, you'll see conventional if checked. The default is if I'm getting a loan, then it's going to be conventional financing. If you're going to get to obtain FHA, VA, or other financing, you would check the appropriate box. Now let's go back to the third column from the fourth column from the left. If we were to say in our presentation of this purchase contract, we're going to be putting $800,000 down, or excuse me, $800,000 for the loan amount, it's going to calculate 20% of the purchase price. There's a bullet point that says not to exceed. It is going to be, this is a actual contingency for the buyer. And the contingency is going to consist of a percentage in regards to what the interest rate is that the buyer is willing to go up to before they don't want to continue the purchase. This becomes a contingency of the purchase contract. So in the very first bullet point, it says not to exceed. If I were to say 7% for an interest rate, in the event today's prevailing rates are 7.5%, I as a buyer have no obligation to proceed. and I can cancel or terminate the contract based upon that fact. And when I'm submitting an offer, I don't want, if today's rates are 6.5%, I don't want to put 6.5% in there. I want to put at least 0.25% higher here, because there's always adjustments every single day in regards to interest rates. So if today's prevailing rates are 6.5%, insert 6.75% in there. It gives protection for the buyer. And likewise, if you put 6.5% in there, which is today's prevailing rate, the listing agent is probably going to counter you anyways. I would certainly do that, knowing that there's fluctuations in regards to market conditions. The next bullet point, buyer to pay, how many points? I would suggest inserting 0. That way the buyer has no obligation to pay any points to get the interest rate that they're using as a contingency or threshold. And then you see below in the third column on the left, says it's FHA or VA check, deliver list of lender required repairs. If there's a couple of issues associated with anybody who's pursuing FHA or VA financing. First of all, if I'm going to get an FHA or VA loan, let's assume I check the appropriate box on the right, then there's something that's contractually required entitled an amendatory clause. And the amendatory clause stipulates that if the appraised value doesn't come in at the purchase price, the buyer has no obligation to proceed. Sounds good, right? And that's true even in the event the buyer removes their appraisal contingency. They still can cancel ultimately. And the dilemma is such that let's assume I'm offering $1 million and that's the accepted purchase price, but it appraises at $950,000. Well, I'm the buyer, I'm getting an FHA loan, and I remove my appraisal contingency. Up until the date of the close of escrow, I can keep this transaction going and I can cancel without any loss of my deposit. So that's a protection afforded an FHA or a VA buyer versus a buyer who's getting a traditional conventional loan. So on a conventional loan, if I remove my appraisal contingency and I decide later that I want to cancel based upon the appraised value because it came in lower than the purchase price, I can do that, but I'm at risk of losing my deposit. But for an FHA or VA loan, contractually, you're required to complete an amendatory clause which states that no matter what, if the appraised value doesn't come in at the purchase price, the buyer can cancel. Now, if I'm a seller and I know the appraised value came in at $950,000, I'm going to be very concerned because maybe I just can't arbitrarily cancel as a seller. The buyer can keep my property tied up through the close of escrow and ultimately cancel that transaction. Now, I don't see that happening, but it's just something I want you to be aware of. In the event you accept an offer that includes FHA or VA financing. In addition to that, for an FHA or VA loan, the underwriter may stipulate that there are certain repairs that must be completed. If the seller refuses to complete those repairs, it's a valid reason for the buyer to cancel because the lender's not going to fund the loan anyways. It's a buyer's market, so I don't think it doesn't matter at this point in time, FHA or in regards to repairs. Most sellers, if they have any sense of reasonableness, are going to comply with the buyer's request for repairs unless they're very unreasonable, as a matter of fact. So any question about the loan amount and or mandatory clause in the event there's FHA or VA financing involved? And then the other aspect that we see, and this is very common with the VA financing, theoretically, the veteran is trying to come in with no less, or actually no more than 1% or 0% down. So what we see in many cases in which there are transactions in which the buyer is getting a VA loan, often the buyer will offer more than the purchase price because they want all of their closing costs to be covered. Now that sounds great. However, if the property doesn't appraise, then it becomes an issue.
What is the loan amount limit on the FHA and VA?
I'm not sure. It's pretty high as a matter of fact. Remember, FHA is applicable for multifamily properties, assuming the buyer occupies one of the units also, but VA financing is very generous. It's just the upfront funding fees are about 1.5% of the loan amount, so it's pretty expensive. But that's why somebody who's getting an FHA loan or VA loan is increasing the purchase price, getting the seller to pay those costs for these upfront mortgage insurance premiums. And then section E2, additional financed amount. Let's assume we're getting a second deed of trust, or we're asking the seller to carry a second deed of trust. And in the event the seller, you're going to ask the seller to carry financing in terms of being in the second position, you have to disclose that to the first trustee lender. Otherwise, that'll be a loan problem. And so it's going to be notified here. They're going to be notified when they look at the purchase contract. And then section E3, occupancy type, the default is primary. So that means, and everybody probably reads the news now, we know that there are various politicians that are now being accused of specifying financing for purposes other than them occupying the properties or primary residence. Adam Schiff, for example, right? So the claim is that he solicited or obtained financing for properties in which he was claiming he was going to occupy the property. But he has multiple primary residences. Now that is a violation of law. It's loan fraud, as a matter of fact. So when you're working with buyers, and sometimes they're going to be acquiring the property as an investment property, and they want to lie about the fact that they don't want to get an investment property loan because it's more costly, it's more expensive, and they just want to specify it's a primary residence loan. Your advice should be don't do that because it is loan fraud. And the lender can call that due and payable, and who knows about the other repercussions. So it's just something to be aware of. People sometimes think that they're more clever. And certain cases, maybe they live in Irvine and they buy a property that's 2 miles away, and it's going to be an investment property. And maybe the property they're buying is smaller. So another buyer is going to look at that and say, we don't believe this for 1 moment, that this is going to be a property you're going to be occupying. If you're 70 years of age, maybe there's a reason you're downsizing. So there could be some valid reasons, matter of fact. But don't allow your clients to put themselves in a position in which they're committing loan fraud when they're suggesting to do something like that. So if you know they're buying a property as an investment property, be sure to check the appropriate box.
What about if you change your mind after a few months? You're doing the repairs and it takes a few months and then you decide, oh no, I don't want to live there, I want to rent it. After the loan has been executed.
I think it's intent. That's what it's going to come down to. So how do you prove intent? That's a good question, but that's what's going to come down to in the event the lender looks at it. If the lender has any questions, they're entitled to perform an occupancy inspection. They will come into your home and they will look in the closets. There's so many different things you could do. Where are your bank statements being mailed, your mailing address, things like that. So there's so many simple ways that a lender can make a determination whether or not you were actually occupying the property as your primary residence. So yes, I think that's a good question, Faye, because circumstances do change.
I've
Maybe,
seen that being done actually.
yeah, what if there's a job
Last
transfer?
couple of years or 3 years, yeah.
If there's a job transfer, maybe I never anticipated that. I don't want to sell the property, I want to keep the property. So those are valid reasons, I think, at least it's defensible. And then the system is going to calculate section F, a balance of down payment. So if our purchase price is $1 million, we're putting $200,000 down, it's going to calculate an amount of $800,000. The purchase price total is still going to come out $200,000. Any questions about that? Okay. Then page 2, seller payment to cover buyer expenses and costs. Section 3G1 to the right, section 5E. When we look at the second column from the left, that's referring to the body of the purchase contract. It's going to give you clarity to understand exactly what these things mean. And to the right, there it says seller credit to buyer. And what is common today is that many buyers are asking for the seller to pay closing costs, things of that nature. And if that's the case, we would check the box, seller credit to buyer. And then to the right, we would insert $1 on it. Let's assume it's $20,000. Now, I continue to say our original offer was $1 million, but we settled on a $2 million purchase price. Here's another example in which the dollar amount does not change. So even though I said 20,000 on a 2 million, excuse me, $1 million purchase price, and we finally agreed to a $2 million purchase price, that credit of $20,000 in my example will not change. It does not adjust on a percentage basis. Now, the critical aspect is that if your buyer is getting a loan, as soon as you're aware that there are going to be credits granted in favor of the buyer, you need to immediately notify the lender, because in the event the buyer is getting a loan, the lender must approve those credits. And it doesn't matter what type of credit, maybe you're crediting back the motion commission, maybe the seller's issuing a credit. Although this will not include any commissions that the seller is paying to the buyer's agent. So it's critical that the buyer, excuse me, that the lender is notified as soon as possible. Sam, do you have a question?
Yeah, right now, like a lot of lenders are talking about 2-1 mortgage buy downs. Would that be represented in this segment?
You could do it right there, as a matter of fact. So if everybody knows, let's assume nobody knows what a buy down is. It's just prepaying interest for that period. It could be for 1 year, it could be for 2 years, as a matter of fact. And now strategy, that's a different issue, but you would just simply put, if you wanted to, $20,000, and they could be used to buy down the interest rate for 1 or 2 years, as a matter of fact. So that's perfectly acceptable. Now, in his example, which, and why would we do that? Because the buyer believes in the next 2 years, I'm going to be getting a raise and I'm going to be earning a lot more money. So I am concerned about making a payment based upon a fully indexed loan. Well, even if you do obtain a buy down with your lender, they're still going to qualify you at the fully indexed rate. So let's assume rates today are 7, I buy it down to 5%. So the very first year, I'm making a payment based upon 5%. Second year, I'm making a payment based upon 6%. And the third year, then my payment is based upon 7%. Well, when qualifying for the loan, the lender is going to look at the fully indexed loan as 7% when qualifying them. So it doesn't assist in qualifying, it just enhances a buyer's cash flow. And then today, do we think that maybe your rates are going to be going down? Possibly. I've been hoping it was going to happen sooner, it hasn't. But there are discussions possibly about the Fed reducing the Fed funds rate, and if that does, it's possible the bond market may follow that. And if we're not certain about how interest rates work, I'm going to tell you briefly. Yeah, we hear about the Fed's, decreasing interest rates, but it's still, mortgage rates are market driven. So the only reason mortgage rates are going to come down is because the investors who are willing to buy mortgage-backed securities believe that the economy or that rates will come down eventually. So they want to lock in a certain return. So just because the Federal Reserve decreases interest rates does not mean that mortgage-backed securities or the interest offered to individuals pursuing mortgage loans will come down. We hope that it's going to follow in tandem.
Right, sometimes it's the opposite.
It could be, but if you want to follow,
Recently.
you have an idea about how mortgage interest rates are going to be fluctuating on a daily basis, look at the yield on the 10-year treasury. And if you see that the yield on the 10-year treasury is going down, then it's likely that interest rates on mortgage-backed securities, meaning mortgage loans, are coming down. If the yield on the 10-year treasury today is going up, and it is going up a little bit, mortgage rates are probably going up. So it's the return that investors demand. And the 10-year treasury seems to be, it's the basis upon the yield that investors demand when buying mortgage-backed securities.
Another question, back to this column, I thought the credit, the seller or the buyer, you don't know exactly how much until the closing, right? So how are we gonna build on this one here?
Well,
At the beginning.
you're not going to know, but you can just, when you're making an offer, if you want a credit, you can make that demand. I'm glad you brought that up because there's something I failed to mention. So let's assume that I want a $20,000 credit. And we really don't know what my closing costs are going to be. So that's a very good question. So let's assume the closing costs are only $15,000. but the seller agreed to a $20,000 credit. What happens? Well, I'm going to lose that $5,000 differential unless I specify that any unused credit will be used to reduce the purchase price in a like amount. So we look down farther at section, and I'll go through it, I think it's section 5. It specifically indicates that any unused credit will be lost unless you specify that the unused credit will be used to reduce the purchase price.
Specify here?
Yeah, we would do it farther down.
Oh, okay, okay.
For example, we could add language, right, under other terms. We could specify that any unused credit based in the preceding section will be used to reduce the purchase price by a like amount. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very important part, because sometimes we're looking for dramatic or large credits that will exceed our closing costs. Now, what are closing costs? It can include my property taxes, it could include prepaid interest, my portion of the escrow fees, insurance. So there's a number of things in which closing costs that term encompasses. And then this part's very, very important, section 3G3. Now we're representing a buyer and we all want to get paid. So before we ever show property, and does not include leases, but before we ever show property, and before we ever write an offer, we have to have a buyer representation broker compensation agreement signed, specifying the compensation that the buyer is going to be paying us as the buyer's agent. Now, I don't have the form up on the screen, but when talking about the buyer representation broker compensation agreement, it must be a specified amount. So let's assume we talk to the buyer and we say, okay, we want 3%. And then we tell the buyer, but I'm going to write in that contract that if the seller, because we're going to ask the seller to pay that compensation of 3%, seller only agrees to pay 1%, and I'm going to forgive the balance if I write that into my contract with the buyers and water bill. It has to be a specified percentage or amount. Whereas what the buyer's obligating themselves to pay to the buyer's agents. That went back to August 19th of last year, and it's California law as of January 1st of this year. So when we're submitting an offer, we're going to check the box because we're going to ask the seller to pay the buyer's agent's commission. And then to the right, you'll see it says seller agrees to pay buyer's broker out of the transaction. Let's assume we have a buyer representation broker compensation agreement for 2%. We would insert 2% in there. Now, this is always a negotiable part in regards to the seller that can issue a countering that. When you complete that BRBC, the buyer representation broker compensation agreement with the buyer, and let's assume it's 2%, but the seller only agrees to pay 1%. Contractually, the buyer has an obligation to pay that 1% differential.
But you can forgive it though,
You would have to modify the agreement
in writing.
in writing, exactly. Or you can even issue a credit to the buyer through escrow. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. You just need to specify specifically how much their buyer is going to be obligated to pay you before you submit that offer, or actually before you even show the property.
Because escrow is gonna require this, the BRBC, right, a copy of that.
They can ask for that. Yeah, so the seller can ask for that at some point in time. Things have changed in regards to what's taking place. But it is going to be escrow, you're right, Thomas. That ultimately is going to be asking for that buyer representation broker compensation agreement to confirm the amount of compensation that the buyer's agent is going to receive upon the successful close of escrow.
If you're not going to charge the additional percent and you rewrite the contract, again, I'm generalizing, that would be perhaps more beneficial to the buyer. Because for them to pay that 1% is gonna go into escrow and then they get that money back.
Yes, it's just the buyer's gonna have to have confidence in you that when you tell them, look, I'm gonna put 2% in here, but the seller's only agreeing to paying 1%, That's all I'm going to collect.
Yeah, we'll amend the contract.
We'll amend the contract subsequently. So the buyer has to have confidence in you that you're going to live up to your word.
As opposed to tell them, hey, pay that additional 1% and I'll give you credit.
Yeah, by the way, you can structure it how you want, right? So those are options that you can do. Interestingly enough, you have that option. You can amend the buyer representation agreement, or you can just simply issue a credit back to the buyer through escrow, and that is not a violation.
When you do credit, it doesn't mean that they have to pay the money in and then they get it back. It just means
They
that they
get
don't have
credit
to
on
pay.
the
Yes, yeah,
estimate and
they
they
just
take
don't.
less money in.
Yes, yes.
But what they can't do, any credits that you, no matter what, if it's a credit from the seller or a credit from the agent, it can be never used to alleviate the down payment the buyer must come in with in the event they're getting a loan. So my example of a $1 million purchase, they're putting 20% down, even though I'm getting credits of $20,000, the lender's going to require me to come in with $200,000. So they are not going to allow you to take the credit that you're offering to offset the initial, that down payment.
Richard, all these percentages, what the seller will pay with the buyer within the contracts, those percentages all have to be approved by you, and even the agent individually wants to reduce it and amend the 2% to 1%, do they need prior approval from you as the broker?
Well, I don't make that a stipulation, but I don't want to work for free.
Yes.
So if someone were to say, I'm not gonna charge anything, then I'm gonna have a problem.
No, it's
Yeah.
not charging, it's like the 2%, you start with the 2% with the buyer and.
Ultimately, I have to approve that because escrow is going to be sending an instruction to me to approve the credit.
Also, you initial the contract, so that's how it used to be, right? The broker
Yeah, you know.
Initials every agreement.
Yeah, realistically, when you look at a purchase contract, we have so many days, well, in a purchase contract, that's not necessarily true, but in a listing contract, the broker has 5 days to rescind a listing agreement, when we can do that. So from my perspective, I am very open in regards to agents issuing credits to their clients simply because I don't believe you want to give your money away. So it would be a rarity for me to ever not agree to the credit that you promised your clients. I really can't think of any examples unless someone has said, well, I don't want to charge it anything. Well, why don't you charge it?
Yeah, it's yeah, no, that's not what I meant, reduction in the percentage, you start with 2.5 or 3 or 2.
I have no objection to that.
Yeah, okay,
It's just escrow is going to ask for a written document signed by the broker.
Sure.
To confirm.
okay.
So
So I can see in the case of relatives or close friends, you wanted to reduce the commissions.
how big is your extended family?
We can be doing that for everybody. Yeah, hundreds of buyers.
Everybody has, we're all related somehow, right?
I just don't want to do it for free, you know? There's some people
I
say,
know.
oh, that's my
I
sister, my
think
sister,
the
I'm
audit
gonna
had
do
the
it for free."
limit in a year, right?
Yeah. I think reasonableness, that's all I ask for, nothing more than that.
Logical.
And then section 3H1, verification of all cash. Yeah. Prior excerpts or revisions of the purchase contract, the default wasn't that these documents are attached. And remember, verification of cash, the default is I'm attaching to this purchase contract evidence that the buyer has all cash to pay. That's the default. Not that I'm going to provide it later. So don't check the box saying 3 days after, because if I check the box, I'm going to submit the offer and I'm telling the listing agent and the seller that once we have an accepted offer, then I'm going to provide you documentation that I have money to pay all cash. Now, why would anybody accept an offer unless they're foolish without any documentation that the buyer has the money? So the default is you're attaching that documentation. Same thing with verification of down payment and closing costs. When you're submitting the offer, the default is that I'm going to submit on behalf of the buyer their bank statements, their investment account statements showing that I have $200,000 available to me for the account. And likewise, verification of loan application. I'm going to attach, the default is that I've attached the pre-approval. And I would never submit an offer, nor would I actually work with the buyer unless I have some kind of type of pre-qualification. Now, you may speak to them initially, but, and we all have aspirations. I want a $5 million property, but I can only afford $500,000. So be sure that your clients are speaking with their lender and you have a pre-approval or at minimum, pre-qualification. And if you look to the right, you can see there's different boxes: pre-qualification, pre-approval, and fully underwritten pre-approval. Pre-qualification means, and the letter is going to be, it's going to notify this. Pre-qualification is, I contacted my lender and I said, I earn $1 million a year. I haven't provided any documentation. Now, what value is that? That's a good question. Maybe, often, including myself, I'm self-employed, and I can assure you, I take advantage of every opportunity I have to minimize the income that I'm reporting to the IRS. So maybe I'm grossing a lot of money, but on my tax return, I'm showing $20,000 in net income. So buyers don't necessarily understand that. So that's something to keep in mind when you're a listing agent, you're evaluating these things. Pre-qualification means it's just the lender's issuing a pre-qual saying, this buyer will be approved for the loan amount they're seeking, but I haven't gotten any documentation. Pre-approval, they have obtained actual income documentation, for example, possibly tax returns.
So there could be exception to that, right? To the verification of all cash, if it's like a high profile client, like if it's a celebrity or like someone that everybody knows has money, but they don't want to just set their financials out there. But that, there's sometimes people don't want to put their information out there like that.
I wouldn't take your word for it. That's up to the seller.
Right.
And if I'm an agent and just because someone is making the representation, they have the money, I would.
Yeah.
That would be my approach. But the seller ultimately is going to make that determination. The other thing that happens often, especially in California, often buyers don't have their funds patriated in the US. So they're providing some kind of a statement based upon UN. What's the conversion rate? Can they actually get the money out of the country? Now, my advice to my seller would be, I wouldn't accept that. That would be my approach, or at least letting the seller know that that money is not in the US. And can we rely on them to perform?
And usually for loan approval, I recall they need the money to be seated in their account for 2 months.
Usually, yeah, for a traditional loan approval, right, it has to be seasoned
Season,
for 2 full months. That means 2 full months bank statements.
show that the money. is there.
That, yes, exactly. And then also keep in mind, let's assume no one can afford property in Orange County anymore. And children they're getting help from their families. That's very common. Now they may be getting a gift. And the parents are going to be required, let's assume it's parents, to provide 2 full months of bank statements. However, if the lender looks at that bank statement and they see an odd deposit of $500,000, they're going to look at the donor and say, you need to document that. I mean, did you borrow that money from somebody? Did you take a loan? So there's no way of masking things like that. And it's just something to keep in mind when you're speaking to your buyers about what they're going to be doing. The lender should know that, obviously, but also we should be aware of that. Yeah, you
So-
just, okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. So it is very valid and reasonable for the agent from the beginning, getting to the financial aspect of the buyer to make sure that they qualify, they can do all of this and ask them, provide all of this before I can show you the property. Is that what the agent tell people?
Well, every
Mhm.
agent has a different approach, but I would think that, but I think there's some validity in regards to separating yourself, because people sometimes are nervous about presenting the financial information to the realtor versus the lender. But I think you should say, hey, before any seller is going to give serious consideration to your offer, you need to go through this process with your lender. And if you're not giving a loan, then you need to provide the documentation indicating that you can pay all cash. And they can redact account numbers, things like that. And then let's assume whether you're a listing agent or an agent representing a buyer. So when you're looking at bank statements, well, let's assume it's my son whose name is Alton. And And he presents my bank statements to a buyer. Well, my name is Richard Moore. Does Alton really have authority over that account? No, they don't. So that's something else to look at. Is that sometimes that happens. They'll give someone else's bank statements, and that's fine, but it's something to question. Let's not waste your time. And if I'm a listing agent, I'm going to be questioning that. Do they really have authority over those funds? Or sometimes, it just offers are made and then you just see different names on the bank statements. It's questionable. Do they really have authority over those funds to make that offer? And then let's see, yeah, there's a couple of things I think I may have forgot about here. But let's just continue on down here. So we talked about verification on application, section J now, final verification of condition. Within the contractual obligation of the parties are such that the buyer has an opportunity to inspect the property 5 days before the possession. Now, that does not mean I'm going to go in and look for additional deficiencies in the property. It is just to confirm that the property is delivered in the condition in which I found it at the date of acceptance. Now, what is the date of acceptance? It is, I'm a buyer. I submit an offer today. The seller receives it, the seller signs it tomorrow, and they return it to the buyer tomorrow. The date that it's delivered is the date of acceptance. Not the date of the last signature, but the date of delivery.
Delivery to the buyer.
Back, right? So let's assume there's no counteroffers, right? Yesterday, I'm the buyer, I submitted an offer yesterday. Seller receives it today, seller signs it today. They deliver it back to me tomorrow on Friday. Tomorrow is the date of acceptance. So that's very critical because now everything in the contract is based upon the date of acceptance, which means the contingency periods, those of escrow, so on and so forth. And when you get escrow instructions, it's incumbent upon you to look at those escrow instructions because there are times the escrow officer, and rightfully so, may not necessarily know the date of acceptance. I want to be sure that the escrow instructions comport with the timeframes that you anticipate.
So it's another thing for the final verification condition is that any repairs that were agreed to should be made by that date.
Yes, very good point. So that's the purpose. Is the property in the condition in which I found it as the date of acceptance? Any repairs that the seller agreed to, are those completed? So we talk about final verification of conditions. The question comes up, well, they didn't paint this wall, that was gonna be $150. I don't want to close escrow. Well, that would not be a material item. If the buyer refuses to close based on something like that, would then be in breach of contract? Quite possibly. If it's to replace the air conditioning unit, seller didn't do that, well, that's probably a material breach. And I would say the buyer probably has no obligation to continue to close the transaction. The threat's always going to be, no matter what it is, that the buyer is not going to close. Now, let's assume the buyer closes and there's something that wasn't done. What are their options? It is a civil action. So they have to sue them. Hopefully it's a small claims action. It's not worth it to get into additional litigation. Back to.
And you don't want to not close for $150.
Exactly. But people become very obstinate, and I think that gets down to when you're talking to clients, the biggest mistake agents make sometimes, they will elevate the frustration of their client. They may hear negative things from the other agent and or on behalf of the other agent's principal. Don't communicate that to your client. Just moderate, or just don't communicate certain negative things at all. Why are you going to cause consternation with your client? Just work through it. Right? So don't cause people to become angry so they draw a line in the sand. It's not going to benefit anybody. And you're going to make their lives much happier when that transaction closes. So we talked about final verification of condition, assignment requests. And what is very common, often a purchase contract is submitted. Let's assume it's Richard Moore, who's the buyer. And I have the default is I have 17 days thereafter to notify the seller that I'm going to assign my interest in the contract to another party. Now, if it is, for example, my revocable trust in which I'm 100% owner of that, it doesn't require the seller's consent. If I'm assigning my interest in this purchase contract to an LLC, and maybe I have a 50% interest, well, it requires the consent of the seller to do that. So there's something that's not uncommon.
Or if you're gonna add someone to the contract.
That's an assignment, correct? Or maybe there's 3 people on the purchase contract and you're eliminating one of them. So you're assigning, those 3 people are assigning their interest to the remaining 2 parties. So let's assume I have 1 party on that purchase contract and I have a loan contingency and I'm going to add Carlos. Well, I might have concern. First of all, the contract indicates that the seller is entitled to ask for, let's assume we're getting a loan approval based upon Carlos's ability to qualify. So with that said, I may not consent to the assignment because if I add Carlos, because he has a 200 credit score. Yeah. I may not consent to that assignment. He wouldn't be working here if he had 200 credit scores. But
Doesn't even exist.
yeah,
Doesn't exist.
that's pretty low, isn't it? I had to choose something really facetious, so. So that, most assignment requests are granted. You can't unreasonably withhold an assignment request.
But if you make the offer and you want to sell the contract, remove yourself and assign it to an outsider.
On the agreement of assignment document that you would be using, you have an obligation to specify any compensation you're earning for signing that contract to a third party. So you have a buyer that accepted the contract and he wants to assign it to me, and I'm willing to pay that buyer $50,000 to get this contract. That's something that has to be disclosed to the seller.
And the seller reject that. If it's-
Well, they might renegotiate the transaction. I think that's a very good question in regards to what's happening.
And be proven that it's a good buyer
Yeah,
with
yeah.
all the other documents.
So that's assume that they can perform.
Yes, right. If they can't perform, the seller has no obligation. What's interesting about the assignment of agreement addendum is Form AOAA, it does not relieve the original buyer of any of their obligations of the purchase contract. So we would never use an assignment request in which the buyer is not relieved of their obligations. We would use the CAR form in doing that. Plus, you have an obligation to provide all the disclosures, so on and so forth. So there are other aspects in doing that. We don't want a third party assignee now coming in without acknowledging and validating by signing the disclosures that they haven't received those. Loan, well, there is no loan contingency to the right, so the loan. Let's assume I'm staying, here's another aspect. I stated in here that I'm gonna put 20% down, or maybe I said I'm gonna pay all cash. But during the process, I changed my mind and I wanna get a loan and I wanna put 10% down. Well, the contract indicates that the seller cannot interfere with the buyer changing their minds in regards to financing, but they can rely on the buyer's assertion that I'm gonna pay all cash, or I'm gonna put 20% down. And if the buyer changes their pursuit of a loan different than what's in the purchase contract, and they fail to get the loan that they choose to pursue, then if they cancel based on the loan contingency, it's likely that the seller would be entitled to their deposit. So even if I said I'm gonna put 20% down, and then I decide I'm gonna put 30% down, and I can't get the loan, why can't I get the loan? Because I don't have 30% to put down. Well, the down payment is not a contingency of the purchase contract. So the buyer, it's a contractual covenant. For any of the down payment that the buyer said he's putting down, they're stating, if I don't have it, then I would be in default if I can't come up with that money. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, if the buyer changed his mind to get a loan, how about the contract? Do they need a new contract?
If the seller's going to agree to it, yes. If they, here's what they can do. If they say, this is what we often see. Usually, buyers will come in and say, I'm gonna pay all cash, especially investors. And they'll give you a bank statement showing they have enough money, but you don't know if they've got 20 offers out there. And then ultimately, they pursue financing. Can you stop them from closing based upon that? No, they just need to close as agreed. So cash is considered, is defined in contract with formal financing. So if they change their mind in regards to what they're going to do, as long as they close escrow, then they won't be in default. But if they pursue financing other than what's specified in the contract, they say all cash, but I'm going to pursue a loan, they can't get the loan, that's the problem. They can't close on time.
But they don't need to have a new contract.
No, but if you're, let's assume that the buyer, if the buyer is really forthright, the buyer should say, hey, I want to modify the contract. And instead of putting 30% down, I want to put 20% down. And to retain the loan contingency based upon the circumstances, there should be an amendment to the contract. So yes, yes. I
And the
mean,
seller should agree, if not, the seller can cancel.
no, the seller can't cancel, but the seller can just hold them to the original offer, which is which was 30% down. I think the market conditions are going to really dictate what the seller is going to do in a situation like that. Are they willing to, does the buyer, if the buyer has removed the other contingencies, can they find reasons to cancel based on property conditions, things like that? Possibly, as long as it's good faith reason for cancellation. Appraisal. Let's see, all right.
The seller's approach are changing last 3 months compared to 2 years.
Sellers are still not reasonable.
Especially in Orange County and.
Yeah.
Irvine, right?
A little bit more, but buyers are being very aggressive. That's what I'm saying. And then sellers get angry. So
Mhm.
instead of, so that's the goal as a listing agent. Don't take this personally. It's because builders now, they're offering, certain builders in Irvine are offering $100,000 commission. They're offering concessions of $100,000, plus they've already reduced the purchase price. So that's the kind of market we're in, as a matter of fact. And it's something to keep sellers apprised of. This is your competition, actually. So keeping the emotional aspect out, if at all possible, is by far the best thing. What is the seller's real motivation? Of course, everybody wants to get the most amount of money, but buyers are very nervous. So it's much more common now to see very aggressive buyers, especially after they have a property in escrow. One recently failed. They're asking for $100,000 in repairs for a home that was a year old or something. They're just trying to get a price reduction. They said, okay, well, how about 99,000? Then we had a seller, and just someone, we got a good offer for $1,650,000, and they wanted the charger for the car, $500, and the couch. And the seller refused. And now the next offer we have is $1,500,000. And now it's a short sale. And the seller's delinquent on the second deed of trust. And there's a notice of default already filed against the property. So how foolish can you possibly be? But they were just obstinate in regards to the way they're looking at these things.
Oh, so over the car charger and the couch?
Yes.
Hey, over $1,500,000.
Wow. That's.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the seller that was forced to sell based on a few months later, what happened?
Already was in default on their second deed of trust.
Really? Oh, wow.
Already in default. And now they're facing a short sale. And the property's in the great park. It's just foolish, just very foolish.
Apparently, lots of good deals in Great Park. Huh?
There, well, taxes
I
are
get
fine.
the, yeah, I get the emails all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, this is stuff they're offering, buy down.
Oh, yeah, we just had one that just is going in, that's gross, $100,000 commission. To our buyer's agent. Yeah,
Wow,
it's a lot.
I have not heard before.
Yeah,
Oh my
I signed the
God.
commission instructions yesterday morning.
Was it from the builder or?
They built, from the builder.
They just want to get that.
They just want to get, they want to get rid of the inventory. They don't care at this point in time. So let's see, investigation of property, well, no, I don't want to move on from appraisal. So if the property doesn't appraise at the purchase price, you can cancel. What happens if someone claims the square footage is 3,000 square feet and the appraisal says 2,500 square feet? Can you cancel based upon the appraisal contingency.
Yes.
No.
No?
Yeah, that's the investigation contingency. So that's found in the body of the purchase contract. That's a good guess. You would think so. But the appraisal is simply an opinion of value, and that's the only reason that it comes in lower. Then you can cancel. The square footage is different or other deficiencies. It's the investigation contingency. So I would suggest that no one ever cancel without speaking to me. So we can see what the reasons
But
are
it's-
for cancellation.
Isn't the listing agent is required to check with the county's records on the square footage and builders info before putting it on the MLS and stuff like that? Is
Well,
there- what is their agent's source for making sure that the property's square footage, lot size is accurate?
I think it's a very good question. Ideally, the assessor's information is something that you should be able to rely on, at least when you're putting a listing on the MLS. It's ideal to use the assessor's values, the square footage, so on and so forth. Sometimes people may improve the house. They may add square footage, so there's a dilemma also.
Yeah.
What I would suggest is that you have some kind of third-party verification in terms of the square footage before you post it on the MLS. Buyers, or excuse me, sellers from, in many cases, they want to make everything look better. Or I think it's 4,000, even though it's 3,500 square feet, right? So that's their estimate. So it's not ideal to put on anything other than which can validate. And then if we have concerns, the representation on the MLS reflects the information from the seller. What I suggest is that when you have a listing you put on the multiple listing service, have the seller initial those pages, because that's their representation. Now, if we put information on the MLS that's inaccurate, it is not just the fact that we have violated the rules and regulations of the multiple listing service, but it's a Civil Code 1088 violation. So the implications are far greater than just being fined by the multiple listing service. So if there is a hearing, the hearing panel, for professional standards, they can actually refer to the Department of Real Estate.
And when you add any of that information, it asks you for a source. Where did you get that
Yes.
information? And you can
Exactly.
put assessor, public records, or the seller, the owner. And then you have to have proof of that too.
You should.
This, to me, is the safe side is that the agent do their own due diligence besides the seller and like verify with the county assessors. Well, does a document?
It's already on. Yeah, it's already, if you look at the property profile, you should be, when you're taking a listing, you should be getting a property profile in advance.
Oh, I
And,
see.
and the listing, the square footage is going to be on there, and at least you have third-party documentation indicating what the square footage is. Plus, when taking a listing, getting a property profile is important because it's going to talk about other things. You want to know how their property is vested. Many times sellers have no idea how their property is vested. They think they put it in their trust, but maybe they didn't. Or perhaps they did put it in their trust and you walk in with a listing contract and you just have Richard Moore signing in the capacity of an individual, but the property is actually owned by a trust. So is that contract valid? It's disputable. Maybe my intent was to sell the property, but Richard Moore himself cannot sell the property if it's vested in the Richard Moore Revocable Family Trust.
So, okay. Property profile comes from title company, you can request it.
Yes. So a couple of ways, you can request it, you can get an account of, you have a good relationship with Lawyer Seven. You run it yourself. I use that constantly. In
Or do
regards,
you run it yourself?
I do. I don't sell real estate, but I use it for so many other reasons to see how properties are vested, encumbrances, things of that nature. So it's invaluable to me.
Even realists, MLS.
Yeah, yes, it can. It's just the difference is a realist will tell you, it'll give you an excerpt of maybe what the trust name is, but it may not give you the full trust name. So it's a little more limited. I like to look at the underlying documents, the grant deed, if I transfer the property into my local trust, for example. Or the other thing you'll see sometimes, people are grant deeding or quit claiming interest all, to different people. And they're not insured transfers, meaning a title insurance company was never involved in those transfers. So now, when you get to the close of escrow, if all the other prior transfers are not insured, Title is gonna say, well, I'm not going to issue a policy. I'm going to need an affidavit signed from all these prior people that transferred the interest, indicating that it was their intent. And it's called an affidavit of uninsured transfer, and it's got to be notarized. So now you've got all these other issues you have to contend with. So when you go into a listing presentation, you want to know categorically, or at least you want to be aware, if you see all these different transfers between people, it's something that you have to address. Otherwise, you may not be closing escrow as agreed.
Yes, yeah. What time do you personally?
I use lawyer's
property?
title, so lawyer's title, Mary Block, you can have you speak with, anyone here, obviously speak with Mary, and they will issue an account for you.
Yeah, so we can get the information.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Question, who ordered the assessor to do the assessment? Is the listing agent to order the assessor?
No, and anytime a property is, let's say, built, the square footage is reported to the assessor, and then theoretically, let's assume somebody remodels it. Ideally, the assessor is going to take that information and modify the square footage, for example. Plus, they're going to reassess the property based upon the value of the improvements. But it's not unusual for an assessor to not increase the square footage on that they're reporting in the event there's been building permits properly obtained and the property's been increased in terms of size. So we may have to contact the assessor so they actually reflect that information.
So every time the owner remodel the house, extended the total footage, they have to report to. the
Yes,
assessor.
they're required to, and you should be getting, and when anytime people, want to improve property by building permit, I would just wait them from doing that. Especially when they're adding square footage, just doesn't make any sense. It's going to haunt you, because if you added 1,000 square feet to a house and it wasn't permitted, and the buyer's getting a loan, the lender's not going to give value to that 1,000 square feet of additional square footage.
I probably have a stupid question, but going back a few minutes ago, when we were talking about the difference between like the square footage and the appraisal, it's because appraisal is like an opinion, whereas the square footage is like just a fact, right?
It's the contract actually, that's a good question. The contract actually specifies that. If you look at the body of the contract, it tells you specifically that if the square footage doesn't match the appraised value, that is not a valid reason to cancel based upon the appraised value.
Okay. Gotcha.
Then if you cancel based upon the appraisal, this is the only time you're required to give the appraisal to the other party. Otherwise, when the other party, the seller asks for the appraisal, you have no obligation to give the appraisal to them. I would never give it to them.
Yeah.
And especially, they'll use it against you, because if the appraised value comes in it, I'll say higher than the purchase price, and I'm trying to get the seller to agree to repairs. If I'm the seller, you say, I'm not gonna do anything for you because I undersold it by $50,000, so good luck to you.
You got a deal, right?
Yeah, you got a deal, so
Okay.
I'm not gonna negotiate with you.
Okay.
But keep
they
in
can
mind,
find that this is public information, right?
what was that?
The appraisal amount is public
No,
No,
information.
No.
It's enough when we do, MLS, there is a app, you can find the.
No.
Oh, no, how much appraised, and how much tax you paid.
well, that's
Year
yes,
before.
that's the assessed value.
Oh,
That's not going to be the appraisal that the buyer paid for.
oh.
And they assess this based on original purchase price of the seller at the time and the 2% increase.
Yeah, under Prop 13.
Yeah.
Very good, very good, very good. So let's say we talked about appraisal, investigation of property, that's very broad. Physical inspections, so something a lot of times you'll see in person, actually, we always want the buyer to get a physical inspection, right? They're hired inspector. But what I never would do in the purchase contract, and I see this often, is we're going to get into a part here which we're specifying who's going to be paying for different reports or costs. Don't ever put the fact that you're getting an inspection report in here, because if there's a loan and the lender sees that there's reference to a physical inspection here, they can ask for a copy of that report. So anything that's included in the purchase contract, the lender has the right to request a copy of. And what if the property is a piece of shit? Maybe the lender's gonna say, I'm not gonna loan on it because my collateral is impaired. So don't ever write in the fact that you're going to get an inspection report. Not only that, for any inspections, it's always the buyer's obligation to pay for any of those too. That's my opinion. That's the high first step.
Yeah.
Informational access to property. It is not a contingency. It's just specifying the duration of time that the buyer has the opportunity to continue with investigations. Now, today's market, if I'm smart enough to continue to allow the buyer to continue investigations. Now, however, if a buyer gets a roof inspection, a chimney inspection, no matter what those inspections are, speeding appraisal, they have an obligation. And this follows a termination of the contract to provide all those reports to the seller. Now, if I'm a seller and the buyer cancels based upon the property condition, and they have a number of reports that indicate the condition is terrible, do I really want those reports? No, I don't, because I'm gonna have an obligation to provide them to any subsequent buyer. Does that make sense? So I've got a buyer, the buyer is very diligent, we've got multiple inspections for the property, pool, roof, physical inspection, and they're canceling. If I'm the listing agent, I'm not gonna press them to give me a copy of those inspection reports. Because once I know about all the deficiencies,
I'm obligated,
yes,
legally obligated,
yes,
To do
so disclose all that.
yeah.
But the buyer have to get the seller to pay for fixing it, right?
It's
Well,
negotiable,
they can request that.
doesn't mean they have to, it's all negotiable.
Yeah, but most of the time, the seller agree to fix it, otherwise they can back out, right?
Yes,
It's
oh yeah.
contingency on the inspection.
So in today's world, when a buyer submits a horrendous request for repairs, most of the times they're trying to get a credit. They're not asking us, they just want money. So your discussion with the seller should be such that, just calm down, let's just negotiate. That's right. Yes, they're negotiating, but don't allow your sellers to get upset. You need to placate them. So this is just all part of the process.
But there are few repairs that are required by law, such as for the termite, right? Is that
Well,
Still legally required.
No,
that
it's not
the
legally
seller-
required. It's once again negotiable. If I put in the purchase contract, I want a termite inspection. The lender's going to, assuming there's a lender, the lender's going to want to see that report. They're going to want to see the notice of work completed or not completed. So they're going to want to see a completion. So there's no obligation to do the termite report. So that's, the property's in poor condition and it's termite infested. What I probably, and the buyer's getting a loan, what I would suggest to my buyer is, let's not put a request that the seller pay for a termite report. You are entitled to have a termite inspection performed, so maybe for $150. And maybe you just want to negotiate a credit. But if you put the report in here, the seller is going to want to see the work completed, or notice the work completed. Now, it's that then. Maybe I just want a credit because I'm gonna remodel this entire house.
So I don't care about termite.
Yes, yes,
Instead, I want to get a good pricing,
yes.
fine price,
Yes.
yeah, for repairs. I see.
And then next, L4 insurance, and this is newer, as a matter of fact, insurance has always been a contingency. But in the contract now, the buyer, there's a specific contingency for insurance, and that means it's not just the fact whether the property is insurable or not, and properties today are much more likely to obtain insurance. So you can go to the California FAIR plan, that's a responsible case. But the other aspect is the cost of insurance is also now a contingency. So it's too burdensome for the buyer. The buyer has a right to cancel based upon the fact that the price or cost of insurance is too expensive.
What kind of insurance? We have different ones.
Homeowners
Fire,
insurance,
flood, earthquake. Or it's just the homeowners, that's it, just the
yeah,
basic.
fire is typically the term that's associated with it. Exactly. And if they have a lender, the lender is going to, demand an insurance policy. But if it's where we see issues, those areas that are in a high fire zone
Or flood.
or flood, or there have been maybe slab leaks in the past. So that's going to be much more costly.
Yes.
Well, what if they cannot get the insurance, because I heard some people may not get the insurance now.
There's an option. The last option is the California Fair Plan, which is, so it will cover anybody theoretically. Now, the premium, that's a good question. And if the premium's too much, or if they can't get it through the Fair Plan, they can cancel. I haven't come across a property that hasn't been able to obtain insurance, I will say that. Some condominiums now, they're having difficulty with insurance. So, because of that, or the fact that the reserves are underfunded, you cannot get traditional Fannie Mae financing. So they're deemed to be unwarrantable condos, and now the interest rate is going to be higher for something like that. So we're seeing more and more projects, condominiums, in which Fannie Mae has said, your insurance is insufficient, or the fact that your reserves are 80% underfunded, we are no longer going to provide financing for this project. So it means a hard money lender, per se, third-party lender.
Do we have, I know other states such as Florida has been famous for that, regarding the insurance and all of that, but do we have any kind of conference, let's say in Irvine, owns all the condos, apartments in Irvine, but apartments, not condos, but do we have similar situations in Irvine or Orange County
Yes.
that they do not? Do we have a list of those?
No, but you
other
can look it
condos?
up. We can look it up. I don't have a list of
Oh,
them.
I see, okay, so but the agent can look which, I guess,
Project is Fannie Mae
project
approved, for example, or FHA approved.
or not.
Yes. Actually, we closed one, or just two last year. They were non-warrantable. They could not, no longer meet Fannie Mae standards. And that's, you wonder why pricing on some of these condos is lower?
Because.
That's why, exactly, exactly.
So we do have those in OC, okay.
Yes, and we do. It's, and it's growing.
Oh, really?
That's the unfortunate part. Well, you think about it. Most homeowners associations are now managed by homeowners. And they're reticent to increase the HOA dues because they're increasing the dues on themselves. And now they have insufficient money for the repairs or the replacement, things wear out. So they're killing themselves, right? By not managing that problem. Review of seller documents. So all these contingencies that default 17 days, you can change that. So seller documents, transfer disclosure statement. As an example, seller property questionnaire, defensible space addendum, whether if it's a pre-1978 property for lead-based paint, or if it's property in a high fire zone. So those are all disclosures the seller must provide within 7 days. Yes. Your contingency period is going to be the greater of the contingency period of 5 days following delivery. Common interest disclosures, everybody's getting tired here. See people yawning, so I'm gonna be trying to get through this faster. Common interest disclosures, it's very common, let's face it. So it's a rarity that there aren't any type of common interest disclosures in anywhere in Irvine, for example, and there could be more than one HOA. So it could be a PUD, it could be a condominium, but when you're looking through the common interest disclosures, what you should be looking for when you're representing the buyer, there's a couple things. If they're getting a loan, the lender is going to make a determination whether or not they have a document. Of course, it's sketching right now, but it's going to indicate whether there's any type of litigation, and litigation could cause a transaction to fail. But also, when you're getting common interest disclosures, you should be looking through the minutes, and the minutes could be, and you're required to provide 12 months worth of minutes as a seller. But sometimes HOAs hold meetings every 2 months, every 3 months, so they may not be 12 sections of minutes. But then the other thing, looking at the financial requirements or financial aspects in regards to the reserves, that's going to tell you whether or not the HOA is appropriately funded or not. So in regards to litigation, it's an HOA certification. And then review of lease or lien items. What is very common are solar panels. It's a contingency from the buyer. If in the event the solar panels are leased, typically it's assumable. If it is a purchase of a solar system, it is not assumable. it will have to be paid off with a close of escrow if the buyer is getting a loan. Time of possession, as of date of close of escrow, as of the recordation. And then seller occupied or vacant units. Let's assume there's a lease back situation. If the seller is going to occupy the property for 20 days or less from the close of escrow, we would use a seller possession form. If it's 30 days or more, we would use the RLAS, residential lease after sale. And then section M3, occupied units by tenants or anyone other than seller. Let's assume we make an offer on a property, we don't know it's tenant occupied, the seller has an obligation contractually to respond, notifying us and using a form TOPA, tenant occupied purchase agreement, or tenant occupied property addendum, notifying us of the fact that this property or that property is tenant occupied. And then seller delivery documents, all the seller disclosures that are provided within 7 days after acceptance. Sign or return escrow holder provisions. Well, we're supposed to return those within 5 days. Sometimes buyers think they're concerned about moving forward. I think if I don't sign the escrow instructions, I can get my money back. It has no bearing. It's not correct. And then time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. The seller has 3 days to pay for the fees to order the common interest disclosures. And they're all very expensive, by the way. And then install smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing. This is important because let's assume the buyer is getting a loan. If the seller doesn't comply within 7 days and the buyer's lender has an appraisal performed and the appraiser specifies or calls out the fact that the smoke alarms were not installed or the water heater was not braced, then the cost of the reinspection contractually is going to be the seller's obligation. And then evidence of representative authority. So let's assume the offer is coming from a trust or it's coming from an LLC. 3 days after acceptance, the buyer has an obligation to provide the documentation indicating that whoever signed on behalf of that entity has the authority to act on behalf of that entity. Sorry for talking so long, guys, but there's just a lot here. I'm going to just go through as quickly as I can here. And then section P1 items included. In the body of the contract, section 9, it talks about these things that are included. But if you ever have any doubts, check the box to be sure that it's going to be included in the property. Because if you look at the MLS and the MLS says certain things are included, it's meaning you need to contractually address that. Otherwise, things may not be included. They may say washer and dryer. If you don't specify that in the purchase contract, then it's not included. And then P2, exclude items, you may want certain things removed. So put that in there. And then section Q1, natural hazard zone disclosure. It's a report that's required, not contractually, but legally. So check, usually what's customary is that the seller pays for it and check the box for environmental. Optional wildfire disclosure report, check the box for seller. And if you want to have a turnout report, section Q3, you can request that the seller provide a turnout report. You can check the box that seller pays. Or if you don't want to have that done, you want to do it after acceptance, you can do that. Then smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing, it's customary that the seller pay.
Well, it's strange that it calls that out again when it was just on the previous page, just
Yeah.
saying that within 7 days, they have to have that installed.
Yeah. Then section Q5 and Q6, government required point of sale inspections reports, and then point of sale corrective remedial actions. Section Q5 report, it's talking about specifically reports. Now, the only aspect throughout Orange County typically that's required is something associated with water conservation and plumbing fixtures. Now, it is not a point of sale. And if you were to say the seller to pay, well, there is no report that's going to be issued with section Q6. Let's assume the house was built before January 1st, 1994. Unless that house was remodeled, it probably does not meet today's water conservation and plumbing standards, or water conservation and plumbing fixture standards. And if you were to say Q6 that the seller to pay, or if you foolishly, as a listing agent, allow that to take place, and let's assume that house is all original, well, the seller probably would have an obligation to pay to replace all the faucets, fixtures, and toilets in that house. So, depending on how aggressive the market is, or, who's the market's favoring buyers or sellers, then that's gonna make you determine how you wanna check the boxes. Escrow fee, when it's common, needs to pay their own. You can specify the escrow holder, which we would specify Sterling escrow too. That's what I would do, because that's how I make money here. And then, owner's title insurance policy, it's customary that the seller pay, you can specify the title insurer. And then Q9, buyer's lender title policy, you can see the contract defaults of the buyer paying for it. If there's a lender, they're going to require insurance or title insurance, and that's what that's for. Then Q10, county transfer tax and fees, it's customary that the seller pay, so I would check that box. In Orange County, the transfer tax and fees are $1.10 per thousand. In Los Angeles, or city of Los Angeles, I think it's $4.50 per thousand. It's huge. It's huge. Yeah. And then city transfer tax and fee. Oh, yeah, it is. That's exactly what I was going. People don't pay any taxes there, right? Q11, city transfer tax and fees. It's a rarity in Orange County to see something like that, but in LA County, there can be a city transfer tax and fees. If you're unsure, check the box and say if applicable. HOA fee for preparing disclosures. It's defaulting to seller because Civil Code 4525 requires the seller to pay for those fees. HOA certification fee, it defaults to buyer. That was required, and it's usually at the lender's discretion. If I'm a buyer, I would want that anyway. HOA transfer fees, that is not relegated by the Civil Code, but it's customary the seller pay. And then private transfer fees, you can say it says seller. The only area in Orange County that currently has private transfer fees is the Ladera Ranch. That's some type of approval. And then section Q18 home warranty plan. It's customary the seller pay for it. And if I'm a buyer, I would want to specify who is going to be providing me with that home warranty plan. If the buyer is not going to request a home warranty plan, let's assume they're going to just virtually get the place. Maybe they don't want it. So check the box, buyer waives home warranty. And let's assume you're buying a property or you're representing someone that's related to you. Under section R, this is an area in which you could disclose the fact that you are related to the buyer. Or I am licensed by the Department of Real Estate and I am buying the property. So you have an obligation to disclose those aspects. So right now, I am done talking and everybody's done listening. So I've covered most of the information in regards to the body of the contract.
Well, and then also, you see all the paragraphs that follow that? These are the explanations that you find next to each one of those line items at the beginning. So if you're looking at one of the line items said 5A, this is where you're gonna find what 5A means or a description of.
Yes, it is. It is. And then a couple of things I just want to talk about briefly. Let's go down to the definitions. Everybody understands this. So when I went through that grid, I covered a lot of this information, not 100% of it, I'm sure. But let's see. Things. They're important. Let's go down to page 14. Liquidated damages. I suggest that buyers and sellers initial this paragraph. In the event the buyer breaches the contract, the buyer's limiting their exposure to the initial deposit, not to exceed 3% of the purchase price. Let's assume there's 2 buyers and 2 sellers. If all parties do not initial this paragraph, you need to complete this by issuing a counteroffer. Otherwise, theoretically, the contract is not deemed to be complete. Or in that counteroffer, if you issue the counteroffer, there's default language in there saying that if all parties to the contract have an initial, it's going to be excluded. Now, in the event the seller breaches the contract, the liquidated damages clause does not apply. There is no limitation in regards to the seller's liabilities. In arbitration disputes, I suggest that all parties initial that. Once again, if all parties to the contract don't initial it, you need to issue a counteroffer. So that will either exclude it or you specifically will state that it's to be included in the purchase contract. And I think I passed up the definitions and then we're gonna be done. See, so we'll be happy to move on.
Rich, can you explain arbitration?
Sure, it's similar to litigation. It just theoretically should be a less costly method of going through a dispute. And arbitration, who could be the arbiter? It could be an attorney that the parties agree to use. So it doesn't mean going to court, doesn't mean a judge, but it can be binding.
So it's in place of voting court.
It is, it is. That's theoretically why, and ideally a little more expedient than traditional litigation.
Pay for
That's
it.
good.
Each party is going to pay for they're going to split the fees. And remember, before anything anyways, even before you go to arbitration, mediation is a contractual obligation in the contract in place. With mediation, it's non-binding and that the parties to the contract will split all the costs and pay for their own attorney's fees.
How often it happens that you have to do mediation or next step of arbitration?
I would say arbitration. What's happened with us, I would say that in the last 3 years, I've probably been to 2 different mediations. And then if there's been an issue, and it hasn't been arbitration, it was litigation. But actually, we never made it to court. There was one case years ago, litigation went on for 4 years. And there was $375,000 in regards to defending. Yeah. Yeah, people become unreasonable. It was interesting, we won. And the seller won also, and to represent the seller. We couldn't recover anything, the seller was able to recover money from the litigant that filed the lawsuit. But we had offered to sell, and the person suing us, the buyer, refused to sell, and she ended up losing. And she ended up suing her attorney for some fees.
So what do you said the buyer and the seller pay for any type of litigation from mediation move forward to court?
Yes,
What about the agents and the brokers?
well, that's why we have professional liability insurance, there's a deductible, but that's what comes into play.
I see,
But
okay,
professional liability insurance does not cover fraud.
I see, yes.
And that's, yeah, the dilemma is, when you're sued, often the complainant will claim fraud. And then let's assume they file suit against you and us, because they was named the broker, right?
Yeah.
Then you have to defend yourself, and what's gonna, notify the professional liability carrier. And then they're going to issue something called a reservation letter indicating, we're gonna provide coverage for you, we're gonna do this, this, and this. However, if we find that there's fraud, we're gonna come back to you to recover all the costs of being covered.
Nice.
So they attempt to cover themselves. Let me just go back to the definitions. Okay, definitions. Acceptance, anybody want to tell me what acceptance means when there's a purchase contract that's submitted?
The other company accepts it and signs it, deliver it.
Delivery, the date of delivery, exactly. Agreement, it just talks about all the addenda, including the purchase contract as is. The property, every property is being sold as is. And then a lot of times we see sellers saying, I'm gonna sell the property as is, I'm not gonna do any repairs. So let's assume we move forward for buyers and members about seeing language like that, and they want to request repairs. Is there anything preventing you from requesting the seller for a credit or a request for repairs, even though when you sign a contract that says it's being sold as is, and the seller is not willing to issue any credits, you can ask for anything you want. Absolutely, yeah. Get them under contract. Once you've got it under contract, the buyer's in control of that property.
Even if it's as is and you do an inspection, you see that there's a bunch of things wrong with
Please
property,
come
the
up
buyer
with
can
your-
still cancel.
you can ask for it, yeah.
And then if I'm gonna negotiate really hard for my buyer, I'm not gonna submit my request for repairs until the last day of the contingency period. Because now the property's been off the market for as many as 17 days. Sellers get nervous, they're more likely to succumb to your request. Yeah, don't be aggressive and say, I'm gonna be a good guy and submit my request for repairs right away. Keep it off the market, right? Let them think about it.
And then you get them with that.
Yeah,
For sure.
That's why some sellers can get aggressive and say you have 7 days
yes.
for listing. So
Yes.
you don't keep it stringing.
Mhm. It's changing now, but yes, oh, you're absolutely right. Very common.
Or just no contingent.
Or no contingencies, yes, or no
Well, Not the
contingencies.
case anymore, though. 3
No,
years
it's
ago.
not the case anymore. Well, the fallacy with submitting an offer with no contingencies, the only way an offer is no contingent is if the seller delivers all disclosures before an offer is submitted. Because once the seller delivers the transfer disclosure statement, there's a 5-day right of rescission. Regardless of the fact that you removed your contingencies, and that's specified in the contract. You better have a good reason to cancel. But people, if you don't submit the transfer disclosure statement in all seller disclosures in advance of the offer being submitted, even a non-contingent offer still will give a buyer an opportunity to cancel. And this is very important, counting days. So let's assume we know that the contract was, we submitted an offer, buyer signed, seller signed, and it was delivered back to me as the buyer's agent. So counting days. Today is day 0. Tomorrow's day 1. So we count weekends, we count holidays. If the execution of an event falls on a weekend or a holiday, then the execution of that event falls the following business day. So let's assume we have 17 days to remove our contingencies, and the 17th day falls on Saturday. Well, actually, I have through Monday at 11:59 p.m. to remove my contingencies. Or the close of escrow falls on Saturday, actually, then the close of escrow actually falls to the following business day. So counting those days is very important, right? So that's true for contingencies, it's removal of contingencies. And then before the expiration, what can a seller do? You brought up on there. And the contingency period is 17 days. I can deliver notice of reform to my buyer, assuming I've delivered all seller disclosures, no sooner than 2 days before the expiration of the contingency. And on the day following those 2 days, I can cancel on that. So that's it for the day. Any questions? Before we wrap it up? I see a hand up.
Are we going to have a loan training, like bring someone who does loans? So
Yes.
and we can-
Yes. Yeah, Carlos has been doing that.
Yeah, we have somebody that are bring.
Oh,
Yes, absolutely.
And it's just to teach you, to let you know what the loan process is, not for you to do loans.
Yes.
Just to know
of course.
when you talk to your client, what they're gonna be doing.
And also title company, do we bring
Yes.
people from
Yes.
title and escrow?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, all the stuff that an
Mhm.
agent is involved with, okay, and inspection?
We haven't done that for a while, but we
appraisal-
have.
How about appraisal and inspection, like we know what the inspector looks for in the house, so we become aware of what to look for as an agent, we need to do it. Just a
We
general
haven't done that for a while, but we have, but certainly. Absolutely.
Appraisal.
Actually, I know that we have somebody comes in, we have somebody that is heavily involved with car. And then he brings along a myriad of people and it just becomes a sales presentation.
Yeah,
So-
and most of them are because they pass that part.
Yeah, and I don't mind that, you know, I don't mind it at all, but, and it wasn't too long ago, we did have a friend of mine who's an appraiser from many years from back.
Yeah, it's good to get trained.
But also, it's, so as far as inspections go, we do an agent visual inspection, but it's not our job to look under
Yes,
the
of
thing
course,
and
I
flip on
understand,
and off
yeah.
all the lights
Yeah,
and,
we
look behind the
don't,
cracks.
yes, I
Yeah,
totally understand.
it's all
that.
visual, so whatever you see.
But but I think it's good to know what inspector, look for,
Yeah.
how they.
Oh, I'd say information is what sets you apart from everybody.
Exactly, exactly. Because we as an agent have liabilities, so it's good, the more information we have and the more we learn, and we can kind of prohibit certain things happening in the future if we understand it and we can.
Yeah, anyone avoid any form of litigation.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Okay, Anyone else? All right, well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
That's
Richard.
great job, thank you.
Appreciate your thinking.
So what do we do in the staff reports? Do you, Richard, inform us of the market, what's happening in the market and anyone getting a new listing or new sales
Usually we do that
announcements?
at the meeting. We do that at the meeting. People have an opportunity to announce their. listing
Yeah,
at the
they're
meeting
listing
or
or
it's-
sales.
Yes,
How about the market trend, the trends? Do we discuss that regarding?
periodically.
Yeah.
You know, as often as you like.
Yeah.